For the past 5 years, Classic Physique has completely changed the landscape of competitive bodybuilding, taking us away from the 3-division status quo where you were either 212, a short bodybuilder, or open bodybuilding, a true bodybuilder where mass champions above all else, or men's physique, where you threw on some board shorts, the legs didn't matter, and it was all about the shoulder to waist ratio. Then along came Classic, a division to redefine what bodybuilding could be, to bridge the gap between men's physique and open bodybuilding, and provide a place for all of those bodybuilders who believe that aesthetics should be higher up the totem pole than mass. With similar judging criteria to open bodybuilding, with some minor posing deviations, and with a height to weight ratio cap, Classic Physique was truly born to be closer to bodybuilding than to men's physique. However, today it seems that Classic Physique has followed in men's physique's footsteps in more than one way. Classic Physique is seen as a stepping stone. It's the division that people go into when they're smaller, or the division people go into when they just don't want to be an open bodybuilder. But a truly successful division or sport cannot be born out of what it is not. So what is Classic Physique? Does it have an identity? Well, I've talked about this in the past, but today we're going to dive into this in more detail, starting off with the positives. Over the last 5 years, you will have noticed Classic Physique reaching your social media timelines, whether or not you follow bodybuilding in any way, shape or form. That's right, I'm talking about Big Daddy Cbum. Chris Bumstead has quickly galvanized public love, a 3rd time Mr. Olympia, going for his 4th this year, and he really has increased the popularity of bodybuilding to the masses. It's safe to say that Classic Physique is now the most popular division, if not it will be soon, and Chris Bumstead is definitely the most popular. So Classic really has helped to bring bodybuilding forward. You can tell that production values are getting better and Classic Physique lineups are getting deeper, which is bringing more money into the sport, which can only be a good thing, right? Positive number 2 is that Classic Physique has most definitely brought aesthetics back to bodybuilding. This is something which I feel was a major motivator for the introduction of this division in the first place. It was a reaction to the bubble gut phenomenon when Phil Heath was demonized on stage for having a protruding gut, as was Kai Green and most Mr. Olympia competitors at the time. People were outraged, including Arnold Schwarzenegger himself, which led the IFBB to see the opportunity to create a division to fill the gap of what people were looking for, because let's face it, open bodybuilding should always be about mass. Now, bubble guts have no place in the sport. However, still slimming down the division wasn't on the table. It most definitely has caused open bodybuilders to look to be more aesthetic because they see that it's more popular within the public eye. So I feel like the creation of Classic Physique was just a positioning statement from the IFBB saying, this is what we want mass, but we want aesthetics, and that translated between the new division and the old. Positive number 3 is definitely that it requires less brutal protocols. Well, requires, it doesn't mean that that's always in existence. Classic really will not require the same level of drugs as open bodybuilding. Taking your physique to 300 pounds is a completely different story to 250, and Classic Physique will naturally cause you to push your body to less extreme places. Now, they are still absolutely extreme. The standard for Classic Physique is still very, very high. However, it is going to be linearly more unhealthy to pursue an open bodybuilding career given the sheer level of mass versus Classic Physique. Posing's back, baby. Yep, the last positive is most definitely the resurgence of posing. It's been amazing to see the Classic Physique impact on the whole sport in general. Posing really has become a higher priority. The art form has been seen, and people like Terence Ruffin and Urs have helped to bring it to public attention. This kind of stuff transcends a sport. It becomes art when you see Terence's videos on social media that he's created, his artistic posing routines. And it honestly wouldn't surprise me if his quirky comments saying to be put in a music video do come true one day. At a certain level, and it is only a certain level because honestly 99.9% of people cannot ever claim this, it gets very close to dance and art. And I would say that posing is truly a great part of Classic Physique and something which made me love the sport in the first place and the division in particular. This also had a translating effect into open though. But that's a different story, and I'm not actually sure that that's a positive for me. So we'll move on to the negatives and start by saying that Classic Physique posing does have problems and is for Classic Physique. I've seen more and more open bodybuilders experimenting with more artistic posing styles, and although this will suit some people, Keon comes to mind, of course, first and foremost, because of his sheer aesthetic dominance. However, for people who do not hold a genetically structured physique that is similar to a Keon, for example, which is pretty much everyone except for Keon, it's not going to suit you. Classic posing really doesn't suit the mass monster aesthetic, and although I appreciate the effort to try and reinvigorate their posing, it should definitely still take the form of open bodybuilding, spit and sawdust, aggressive posing. I don't believe that the more artistic elements of classic posing should make their way over to bodybuilding, and especially not one element, the vacuum pose. The vacuum obsession in my mind is one of the core pillars of the problem with classic physique today, and there are problems. It's not perfect. It's not to say that I don't think that it's brilliant overall, but I'll give my judgment on that at the end of this video. But the vacuum pose in of itself is a problem because of the fact that classic physique does not necessarily have a era identity. It doesn't say we are after Arnold's classic physique or Frank Zane's classic physique or Lee Haney's classic physique or Tom Platz's classic physique, which are all definitely within that classic physique era, but definitely completely contrasting physiques. The vacuum has been the one part that people can really latch onto and identify with. It is the defining factor that is written into the rules of classic physique versus open bodybuilding, and the ability to pull a vacuum and the dominance of people who do on stage in placings demonstrates the fact that it may be lent on too much as a crux to call yourself classic. Just because you can vacuum, first of all, does not mean you should. And this is my problem with open bodybuilding. On people like Samson Dowder, the vacuum pose can absolutely add something in the front double bicep, for example, specifically. And this is something that I've talked about before in my reaction to Jay Cutler's opinions on the vacuum. When you are somebody with that aesthetic look where you can maximize your taper even more and create that ridiculous, arm shoulder to waist ratio. However, for most people with blockier waist, for example, people like Jay Cutler, as he said in the video, it simply does not look good, it does not benefit you, and it actually overrides the importance of abs within bodybuilding, which in my opinion is not something that we should do. Classic physique, having the vacuum as the go-to for every pose, which is how it is nowadays, unfortunately. It shouldn't be, it's not in the rules, but because of the fact that it says it's mandatory in some areas, people have taken that to mean that the more vacuum, the better. Not everyone has to pull a vacuum pose to be able to be a classic physique, and not everyone who does is one. In a lot of poses, actually having developed abdominals is a benefit. One key pose is the ab and thigh. Pulling a vacuum in an ab and thigh, in my opinion, is absolute sacrilege. A vacuum completely removes the definition of the abs, any form of ab development showing, unless you have extremely developed abs, and in my opinion just reduces the pose to a thigh pose. In the amateur ranks, you often end up seeing a straight up and down physique, and it detracts, if anything. Having a developed, aesthetic, symmetrical midsection would truly be a differentiating factor when in an ab and thigh pose, no matter what division. But because of the fact that classic has a tendency to lean on the vacuum for every pose, it pretty much removes it from the equation, and it seems the judges think that's fine, because we have seen people in the past penalized for not pulling a vacuum. The classic physique identity is pretty much just one thing, the vacuum pose. Moving on to negative number 2, and it's that increased revenue and popularity that we were talking about. When you look at classic physique today, you might be reminded of men's physique 5 years ago. It is in a similar spot, especially in the amateur ranks. These lower level divisions, or these divisions with perceived smaller size limits, always will attract people who are quite simply junior bodybuilders who don't have the shape, don't really meet the criteria, but just don't have the muscle to go up a level. So rather than doing the same thing, the true bodybuilding approach of taking a long extended off season to build that muscle and come in the division you're meant to come in, these people just compete year on year in men's physique and classic and place horribly. But this leads to big stacked lineups of 30 people in each classic physique contest, which can mean that not everyone's going to get a fair look in. When you've got lineups that deep and a tight schedule to stick to, and classic physique often being before open, you're not necessarily always going to get a fair eye. I'm not saying that the judging is biased or there's a problem with the judging in the IFBB. Absolutely not. I'm simply saying that the overpopulation of a division, as we saw within men's physique, often leads to a lack of identity and it being seen as one of those stepping stone divisions. The other issue with classic physique is one that's plagued it since the start. Men's physique is arguably larger. Now, this is something which is contentious, right? And classic people will always say that men's physique guys are larger, and men's physique guys will always say they need to grow to get into classic. The truth of the matter is it's fluid because there's no weight cap on men's physique, which makes no sense when you think about it as a linear progression. Classic physique is pretty much just classic bodybuilding. So how is it meant to be closer to open bodybuilding if, in fact, size-wise, men's physique's outperforming it? There's been debate about whether there should be a cap on men's physique for some time now. We'll go into that later on in the video. But it doesn't make sense that you can have these guys weighing similar amounts and yet the legs are completely off the table. If classic physique wants to align itself more to open bodybuilding, then the weight caps are going to have to shift if men's physique keeps nudging them. And I guess connected to the issue of it not having necessarily a set identity beyond, a vacuum pose and less mass, the problem is that we're seeing a lot more people now entering classic physique who should be open, and that issue has only been exacerbated by the prioritization of aesthetics of an open bodybuilding to go along with the introduction of classic. Now that we've got open pros pulling a vacuum on stage, now that we've got guys with better structures getting a favorable look in, and people's waists are most definitely in check, the lines are getting blurrier on both sides between divisions. And if open continues to prioritize aesthetics, then we could be in of a problem. Now, do I think that's going to happen? No. With the rise of people like Ian Vieira, people like Nick Walker, and Rami being the current reigning Mr. Olympia, I think that we've got some time yet before that starts to become a problem. But the point remains that you can do better with a classic style aesthetic physique in open bodybuilding if you spend the time putting on the mass than you can in classic physique without the structure and with the mass. The major problem in all of this is that I feel like classic physique is finally settling into its identity, and I'm not quite sure that I'm in favor of it. We've now got a simple rulebook for classic athletes. They have to have less muscle than open, they have to be able to pull a vacuum, and they have to be able to pull off some artistic posing. And I'm not quite sure that's the right identity we should be settling on. There are so many different ways that you can truly interpret classic, and the public definitely does determine it to be an era-based division. People look to Arnold, people look to Lee Haney and people of the sort as their inspiration for classic physique, but if it's not playing by those rules, if it's not simply an aesthetic flow with muscle and the diversity can still be there, you can be a Tom Platz, you can be an Arnold, you can be a Lou Ferrigno, you can be a Lee Haney, then we're simply going to lose diversity within the division, and that's a surefire way to kill it. Nobody really wants to see Chris Bumstead going up against 5 miniature Chris Bumsteads. We want to be able to have the Terence Ruffins, we want to be able to have the Brions, who bring something different, who could nudge it on different factors than Chris. We want the game to be open slightly, and if it's only favouring one type of physique, then I'm not quite sure that's right based on what classic physique is meant to be. Diversity in physiques is one of the main reasons for the importance of posing in classic physique. It was used by people like Arnold to hide flaws, to hide his thicker waistline. It was used for him to make his back look wider. All of these reasons for posing only matter when you've got diversity and different strengths and weaknesses to show off or hide. All I'm seeing at the minute is a load of people who shouldn't be classic physique being discarded straight away in their lineups, a few people who look almost exactly the same, all of which trying to do Terence Ruffin style posing without Terence Ruffin's physique. So what are some of the possible solutions? These aren't necessarily all mine, they're not necessarily things that will definitely work, but I feel like people have batted around a lot of solutions, first of all for the health crisis and open bodybuilding, and second of all to help define classic physique further. Now, one of them championed by a few people, including Fouad Abiad on his podcast, is to increase the cap of classic or make a classic plus, I think as Greg Doucette wanted. Now, in my opinion, a classic plus or adding another division just goes against the whole reason for having classic in the first place. It's meant to bridge that gap. If it's not doing it properly, it needs to be adjusted. So maybe an increased weight cap is warranted. However, I will say that I think that should be reserved for the pro stage. One of the other solutions would be to lean into classic physique's golden ratio, the ratio they believe that you should have from shoulder to waist to thighs, and create a measurement-based criteria. Your waist should be in proportion to your arms to this degree or as close to, and basically the most mathematically perfect physique wins out. Now, although I believe this did actually drive a lot of classic bodybuilders into creating the physiques that they did, I also think there's only really one bodybuilder, Frank Zane, who actually stuck to it properly or can accredit real success to it. Most of the other ones just used it to help to identify weaknesses, identify where they could grow in order to create a better silhouette, and never necessarily manifested exactly what they were looking to. Bodybuilding is all about working around imperfections, and I think that some guys should be able to have ways around simply not having the genetic structure, otherwise we may as well give out the trophies at birth. The third option is to put a cap on men's physique. Now, this is something that I actually agree with to an extent. I don't think that it should be a strict cap. I simply think they shouldn't be outweighing classic physique athletes on stage, especially to say they're only showing half of their body, or 3/4 if you count the carbs, but who does? There are two scenarios, one of which is that you increase the classic cap, in which case you put the men's physique cap where classic currently is. The other option is you don't increase the classic cap, in which case it's only really fair to the current competitors that you simply match it with men's physique. You make it so that you can force people up in the division, and I think that's very much how it should go. You've got to have some limitations on this, and you've got to be able to stem the growth of men's physique to make it fair on other competitors, so that the weight isn't just consistently driven up to the point where it's then challenging open, which I don't think will happen, but we do see some freaks in that division. But it'll also help to protect classic's position in between those two. Another option would be something like a posing round, and this was done at the Night of Champions once, which enabled somebody to dethrone Ronnie, I believe. This is an interesting area. You actually judge the posing, and it's something which I think that they used to say that they did at the Arnold. I believe that this is something that should be done, to be honest, if you're going to prioritize posing. I believe that presentation is important, and it shouldn't be judged or weighted greatly, but it should have a say. Now, I understand that it does in subtle ways. Your presentation in a lineup doing mandatories is still going to make a difference, but maybe those individual routines should get a little bit more love. To be honest, I'm not sure as to what the right solution is for classic physique. I feel like it's just in a stagnant spot where it could be at risk of being the moneymaker that men's physique was, but also suffering the same fate, being a stepping stone division that loses its true identity. Men's physique was meant to be a beach body, and now it's unattainable to pretty much anyone who steps on a beach outside of Venice. Classic physique was meant to be all about the golden era bodybuilding, or at least classic bodybuilding as a whole. But it diverges itself quite strongly by the focus on vacuum poses and weight cap. Back in those days, mass was still a priority, so does the cap need to change? Does it need to be removed? Or do others need to have some added? I think classic physique is in a really unique position to be both as loved by open bodybuilders and the general public as each other. And I think that that's really important for the development of the sport, and it's something which I think is integral to why classic was created in the first place. I'd love nothing more than to see bodybuilding as a sport increase up the ranks of public attention and get more love, bring in more money, and become more professional in general. Something which has been overdue for decades and which Arnold originally set out to do. Classic may be the key to that, but it needs to keep its identity strong, because at the end of the day, Chris Bumstead is only going to be around for so long, especially with his health problems. He's not going to be 8, 9, 10-time Mr. Olympia necessarily. So we need to prepare for the day where he's gone, and we can stop just saying, look like Chris, and figure out what classic physique actually means to us. Is it Tom Platz? Is it Lee Haney? Is it Arnold? Is it all about the vacuum? Is it about the posing and the presentation? What do we want out of classic physique athletes? Because I'm pretty sure they want to know. I clearly don't have the answer. I don't think anyone necessarily does, which puts us in a dangerous position. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.